I have spent 40 years studying how states compete for power in an anarchic international system, and in all those decades I have witnessed few developments as strategically consequential as what we are observing unfold in the Caribbean basin today. The reports crossing intelligence desks throughout Washington over the past 18 months indicate that Venezuela has acquired or is in the advanced stages of deploying military capabilities that fundamentally alter the naval calculus in the Western Hemisphere, and anyone who dismisses this as mere posturing from a failing petrostate fundamentally misunderstands how great power competition actually works in practice. The specific systems in question include Russian-manufactured K-31 supersonic anti-ship missiles integrated onto Venezuelan Su-30 Mk-2 fighter aircraft, Chinese-produced radar detection networks capable of tracking American carrier strike groups at ranges exceeding 400 nautical miles, and potentially Iranian drone technology with operational radiuses reaching 1,000 kilometers, all of which collectively represent what intelligence analysts are now calling a credible anti-access area denial capability in waters the United States has dominated unchallenged since the Second World War. This is not simply about Venezuela acquiring weapons. This represents a fundamental challenge to the regional hegemony that America has exercised as a matter of strategic doctrine for over a century, and the implications extend far beyond the immediate military balance in the Caribbean to touch upon the viability of American power projection globally in an increasingly multipolar world. When I wrote The Tragedy of Great Power Politics 2 decades ago, I argued that the structure of the international system compels great powers to maximize their relative power position, because survival in anarchy depends fundamentally upon having sufficient capability to deter potential threats, and that this logic applies with equal force to secondary powers seeking to carve out spheres of influence or to resist the hegemonic ambitions of dominant states. The 5 bedrock assumptions of offensive realism remain unchanged. The international system is anarchic, meaning there exists no supreme authority above states capable of enforcing rules or protecting the vulnerable. All states possess some offensive military capability. States can never be entirely certain about the intentions of other actors. Survival represents the primary goal animating state behavior, and states think strategically about how to achieve security in an uncertain environment. Venezuela's behavior over the past 15 years conforms precisely to this theoretical framework, particularly the insight that states facing an overwhelmingly powerful neighbor will seek asymmetric capabilities that exploit specific vulnerabilities rather than attempting to match that neighbor's aggregate power symmetrically. The United States spends approximately $900 billion annually on defense, maintaining 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, the world's most sophisticated satellite reconnaissance architecture, and forward-deployed forces on every inhabited continent, while Venezuela's entire military budget barely reaches $3 billion in a good year when oil revenues permit such expenditures. Given this grotesque imbalance in aggregate capability, Caracas has pursued exactly the strategy offensive realism would predict, acquiring relatively inexpensive weapon systems that threaten disproportionately valuable American assets, thereby creating localized deterrence despite overall weakness. The historical context here matters enormously because the Caribbean has functioned as an American lake since Theodore Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine transformed that 19th century principle from a simple opposition to European colonialism into an assertion of United States hegemonic prerogative throughout the Western Hemisphere. The crisis surrounding Venezuela in 1902, when European powers including Britain and Germany imposed a naval blockade to collect debt payments, prompted Washington to declare that henceforth only American power would intervene in hemispheric affairs, effectively claiming the entire region as a sphere of influence closed to external great power competition. The strategic logic was transparently geographical. Control of the Caribbean meant control of approaches to any future Isthmian canal, which in turn meant the ability to rapidly move naval forces between Atlantic and Pacific theaters without the interminable voyage around South America that the battleship Oregon undertook during the Spanish-American War. For more than a century, this strategic architecture has remained fundamentally unchanged, with the United States maintaining overwhelming naval superiority throughout the Caribbean basin, operating from bases in Puerto Rico, Guantanamo Bay, and more recently, forward-deployed assets in Colombia and cooperative arrangements with allied governments throughout Central America and the Caribbean littoral. The deployment of Soviet nuclear-capable missiles to Cuba in 1962 represented the only serious challenge to this hegemonic structure, and President Kennedy's willingness to risk nuclear war rather than accept that deployment demonstrated how seriously American strategists viewed any credible military threat within their hemispheric sphere of influence. Venezuela's acquisition of advanced anti-ship missiles and integrated air defense networks does not replicate the existential threat of nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida, but it does represent the first plausible challenge to American naval freedom of maneuver in these waters since the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that fact alone should command serious analytical attention. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, approximately 303 billion barrels, representing roughly 17% of total global crude reserves, which in theory should generate sufficient revenue to fund both economic development and military modernization simultaneously. Yet the country currently produces only around 1 million barrels daily, due to decades of mismanagement, corruption, underinvestment in infrastructure, and the technical challenges associated with extracting and refining the heavy sour crude that comprises the bulk of Venezuelan deposits. At current global prices averaging roughly $80 per barrel, even this diminished production generates approximately $30 billion annually in export revenues, a substantial sum for a country with 30 million inhabitants but inadequate to simultaneously service foreign debt, import essential goods including food and medicine, maintain domestic subsidy programs, and fund military acquisitions at the scale necessary to fundamentally alter the strategic balance. This creates an apparent paradox. How has Venezuela managed to acquire billions of dollars worth of advanced military hardware despite economic collapse, hyperinflation that destroyed the domestic currency, and comprehensive American sanctions designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of capability acquisition? The answer lies in recognizing that Venezuela is not acting as an independent strategic actor, but rather as a client state within a broader coalition of powers seeking to challenge American primacy, with Russia, China, and increasingly Iran providing the financial mechanisms, technological expertise, and direct military assistance necessary to transform Venezuelan forces from a purely defensive garrison army into a credible anti-access threat against American naval power projection. Russian arms sales to Venezuela have totaled approximately $14 billion between 2001 and 2014, including 24 Su-30 Mk-2 multi-role fighter aircraft specifically designed for both air superiority and maritime strike missions, 53 military helicopters of various types, 100,000 Kalashnikov rifles manufactured under license in Venezuelan facilities, Russian T-72 main battle tanks, self-propelled artillery systems, and critically, the S-300VM surface-to-air missile system, representing one of the most capable long-range air defense platforms in the Russian inventory. Moscow structured these sales through concessionary financing arrangements that effectively functioned as subsidized loans, with President Hugo Chavez negotiating a $4 billion credit line during a visit to Moscow that allowed Caracas to acquire weapons immediately while deferring payment across extended timelines at interest rates below prevailing market levels. The strategic logic driving Russian policy here extends beyond mere commercial considerations about defense export revenues. Moscow views Venezuela as a critical forward position in the Western Hemisphere where it can establish military presence, conduct joint exercises, position intelligence collection assets, and generally complicate American strategic calculations in a region Washington has long considered securely within its sphere of influence. Russian naval vessels, including guided missile cruisers and nuclear-powered submarines, have conducted port visits to Venezuelan facilities. Russian military advisors have embedded with Venezuelan forces to provide training and technical support. And intelligence reporting suggests that personnel associated with the Wagner Group paramilitary organization have operated in Venezuela, providing security services to the Maduro government. This represents a level of Russian military involvement in the Western Hemisphere unprecedented since the Cold War, and it is occurring precisely because Moscow recognizes that challenging American hegemony requires establishing positions of strength in regions where Washington has historically operated without constraint. Chinese involvement follows a somewhat different pattern, but serves complementary strategic objectives, with Beijing's primary interest centered on securing access to Venezuelan oil reserves through multi-billion-dollar investment packages and development loans, while simultaneously gaining a foothold in hemispheric affairs that serves China's broader ambition to achieve great power status with global rather than merely regional influence. Leaked American intelligence documents from October reveal that President Maduro sent a formal letter to President Xi Jinping requesting expanded military cooperation specifically focused on accelerating production and delivery of radar detection systems manufactured by Chinese defense firms, with Maduro explicitly framing potential American military action against Venezuela as tantamount to action against China itself, given their shared ideological framework and deepening strategic partnership. Chinese radar technology has become increasingly sophisticated over the past 2 decades as Beijing invested hundreds of billions of dollars in military modernization programs designed to develop capabilities necessary for contesting American dominance in the Western Pacific, and the prospect of these systems being deployed in the Caribbean creates surveillance and targeting capabilities that fundamentally complicate American naval operations throughout the region. Modern phased array radar systems can track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding several hundred kilometers, providing early warning of approaching aircraft or ships and enabling defensive systems to engage threats before they reach weapons release parameters. For Venezuela, acquiring Chinese radar networks transforms the operational environment from one where American forces could approach with relative impunity to one where Venezuelan commanders possess real-time situational awareness of American force movements, enabling them to concentrate their limited offensive capabilities against vulnerable targets while dispersing or concealing assets to avoid American strike packages. The specific weapon system that has generated most concern among American naval planners is the Russian K-31 supersonic anti-ship missile, designated AS-17 Krypton by NATO, which Venezuelan Su-30 Mk-2 aircraft have been observed carrying during military exercises including the Sovereign Caribbean 200 drill conducted on La Orchila Island with over 2,500 personnel and 22 aircraft participating in integrated air-sea-land operations explicitly designed to demonstrate deterrent capability against American naval deployments. The K-31A anti-ship variant employs a rocket ramjet propulsion system that accelerates the missile to speeds exceeding Mach 2.5, making interception extremely difficult even for sophisticated American air defense systems like those installed aboard Aegis-equipped cruisers and destroyers. The missile carries an active radar seeker with lock-on capability at approximately 18 nautical miles and can operate in both lock-on before launch and lock-on after launch modes, while a radio altimeter enables precision low-altitude flight profiles that exploit radar horizon limitations and minimize defensive engagement windows. American aircraft carriers represent investments exceeding $13 billion each when accounting for the cost of the vessel itself, plus the air wing of approximately 75 aircraft and the supporting infrastructure required to maintain these capabilities, and losing a single carrier to enemy action would constitute not merely a tactical defeat, but a strategic catastrophe that would reverberate throughout global perceptions of American military power. The fact that Venezuela possesses weapon systems theoretically capable of threatening these crown jewels of American naval power fundamentally alters the risk calculus surrounding any potential military intervention, because Washington must now consider whether achieving objectives in Venezuela justifies exposing a carrier strike group worth tens of billions of dollars to credible anti-ship threats in confined waters where maneuverability is limited and defensive depth is constrained. I have spent 40 years studying how states compete for power in an anarchic international system, and in all those decades I have witnessed few developments as strategically consequential as what we are observing unfold in the Caribbean basin today. The reports crossing intelligence desks throughout Washington over the past 18 months indicate that Venezuela has acquired or is in the advanced stages of deploying military capabilities that fundamentally alter the naval calculus in the Western Hemisphere. Anyone who dismisses this as mere posturing from a failing petrostate fundamentally misunderstands how great power competition actually works in practice. The specific systems in question include Russian-manufactured Kyosha-31 supersonic anti-ship missiles integrated onto Venezuelan Su-30 Mk-2 fighter aircraft, Chinese-produced radar detection networks capable of tracking American carrier strike groups at ranges exceeding 400 nautical miles, and potentially Iranian drone technology with operational radiuses reaching 1,000 kilometers. Collectively, these represent a credible anti-access area denial capability in waters the United States has dominated unchallenged since the Second World War. This is not simply about Venezuela acquiring weapons. It is a fundamental challenge to the regional hegemony that America has exercised as a matter of doctrine for over a century. When I wrote The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, I argued that the structure of the international system compels great powers to maximize their relative power positions because survival in anarchy depends on capability to deter threats. This logic applies equally to secondary powers seeking to carve out spheres of influence or resist hegemonic ambitions. Venezuela's behavior over the past 15 years exemplifies this. Facing a vastly more powerful neighbor, Caracas has pursued asymmetric capabilities that exploit American vulnerabilities rather than attempting to match the United States symmetrically. With a military budget barely reaching $3 billion, Venezuela has focused on acquiring relatively inexpensive but strategically disruptive systems capable of threatening high-value American assets, creating localized deterrence despite overall weakness. The Caribbean has functioned as an American lake since Theodore Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine transformed a principle of anti-colonialism into one of U.S. hegemonic prerogative. Control of the Caribbean has historically meant control of the approaches to the Panama Canal and rapid naval mobility between oceans. Since the early 20th century, the United States has maintained overwhelming naval superiority through bases in Puerto Rico, Guantanamo Bay, and partnerships with regional allies. The only serious challenge came during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when President Kennedy risked nuclear war rather than tolerate a strategic threat so close to U.S. shores. Venezuela's current acquisition of advanced anti-ship and air defense systems marks the first credible challenge to U.S. dominance in these waters since that time. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels, but chronic mismanagement, corruption, and underinvestment have crippled production. Despite economic collapse, Caracas has managed to acquire billions in modern weaponry. The explanation lies in its role as a client state within a coalition of powers, Russia, China, and Iran, seeking to undermine U.S. primacy. These allies provide Venezuela with financing, technology, and training, transforming its forces from a defensive garrison into a credible anti-access threat to American naval operations. Moscow's arms sales alone have exceeded $14 billion, including Su-30 Mk2 fighters, T-72 tanks, and the S-300VM air defense system. Russian advisors, naval visits, and even Wagner Group contractors illustrate an unprecedented level of involvement in the Western Hemisphere since the Cold War. China's engagement has been equally strategic, though more economically oriented. Through massive oil-backed loans and radar system exports, Beijing has secured both resource access and geopolitical leverage. Modern Chinese radar networks deployed in Venezuela enable real-time tracking of American forces across vast distances, narrowing the operational advantages of U.S. naval power. This development mirrors China's own investments in anti-access capabilities in the Pacific, effectively extending that strategy into the Caribbean through its Venezuelan partner. The Su-31 supersonic anti-ship missile, now deployed on Venezuelan Su-30 Mk2 aircraft, has become a focal point of American concern. Its Mach 2.5 speed, low-altitude flight profile, and precision radar seeker make it extremely difficult to intercept, even for advanced Aegis defense systems. A successful strike against a U.S. aircraft carrier, each representing over $13 billion in assets, would not only be a tactical defeat, but a strategic catastrophe, undermining global perceptions of American dominance. For the first time since 1945, U.S. carriers operating in the Caribbean must seriously consider survivability against regional threats. What distinguishes the current Venezuelan situation from earlier anti-American movements is its multilateral backing. Russia, China, and Iran are coordinating to sustain a client state within America's own sphere of influence, raising the costs and risks of U.S. intervention. Iran's role adds an asymmetric dimension, leveraging decades of experience with naval swarming and mine warfare in the Persian Gulf. Iranian advisors have trained Venezuelan crews in tactics designed to exploit the Caribbean's confined geography, where U.S. submarines and carriers are most vulnerable. This cooperation exemplifies the balancing behavior predicted by offensive realism, diverse powers uniting to constrain a hegemon's reach. Venezuela's ability to circumvent American sanctions highlights the limits of U.S. financial dominance. Barter-based oil-for-weapons deals and Chinese oil-backed loans have replaced dollar-denominated trade. Russian banks continue to finance Caracas despite secondary sanctions, viewing the strategic foothold as worth the economic risk. In response, Washington has escalated its own covert and military posture. The CIA has reportedly been authorized to conduct lethal operations in Venezuela, while U.S. naval deployments, including the carrier USS George Washington, have increased in the southern Caribbean under the guise of counter-narcotics missions, but with unmistakable strategic intent. Reactivated in 2008, the U.S. Fourth Fleet serves as the maritime arm of Southern Command, overseeing operations across the Caribbean and Latin America. Its reestablishment signaled renewed American concern about growing extra-hemispheric influence. However, the U.S. Navy today faces resource constraints. A fleet reduced from nearly 600 ships in the 1980s to under 300, stretched thin across multiple theaters. Commanders must balance commitments to the Pacific, Europe, and the Caribbean, while confronting increasingly sophisticated regional threats backed by global powers. Carrier strike groups depend on sea room to maneuver and layer defenses. In the Caribbean's narrow maritime geography, those advantages shrink. Venezuelan aircraft can reach launch positions within minutes of takeoff, while land-based radar negates much of the U.S. sensor advantage. History underscores the peril of underestimating asymmetric threats, from Pearl Harbor's surprise attack to the Cuban Missile Crisis's brinkmanship. Both illustrate that complacency in the face of evolving threats can produce catastrophic miscalculations. American policymakers now face a stark question. Do the potential gains of military action against Venezuela justify the risk of losing billion-dollar assets and global credibility? Any intervention would unfold amid broader great power competition, where China and Russia would seek to exploit U.S. overreach as proof that American power can be challenged even close to home. The danger is not only financial or military, but symbolic. A damaged or destroyed U.S. carrier would echo globally as evidence of declining hegemony, potentially emboldening adversaries and shaking allied confidence in U.S. security guarantees. Venezuela's deterrence posture reflects a classic asymmetric strategy. By creating credible risks to high-value American assets, Caracas can deter intervention despite vastly inferior overall power. The goal is not to win a conventional war, but to raise the costs of coercion beyond what the U.S. public or political system will bear. This mirrors the broader stability-instability paradox. Where nuclear deterrence prevents global war, it simultaneously enables smaller powers to act boldly within limited theaters. Venezuela's case illustrates how conventional anti-access capabilities can produce similar effects in the absence of nuclear parity. If secondary powers like Venezuela, with great power backing, can effectively deter U.S. intervention, the implications for global order are profound. Allies may question the reliability of American defense guarantees, while adversaries gain confidence to challenge U.S. interests elsewhere. The very structure of U.S. hegemony, built on credible power projection, depends on maintaining the perception of military invulnerability. Should that perception falter, the international system could shift decisively toward multipolarity, with regional powers carving out autonomous spheres beyond American control.